Okay, I think we can start as we were a little bit late. So welcome everybody. My name is Rachel. I'm the coordinator of the IE Plus project, and I'll be moderating this panel session, parallel session today. So we'll be looking at the Quality of Life Index for inclusive education. So we were very lucky in this project to have the University of Salamanca be a part of the project. And they are very famous for the Quality of Life Index, which was developed with Verdugo and Sherlock, the Quality of Life model. And they've been working in this project to develop a Quality of Life Index for inclusive education. And this index has become a part of our training. So it's featured in a chapter of our training course that has been translated into all of the languages of the project. So Bulgarian, Spanish, Portuguese, Greek, and Dutch. I will very quickly hand over to our speaker today, Antonio from the University of Salamanca, so that he can tell us more about the tool and how it's been developed. So Antonio, I hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I think that I need to start sharing my presentation. Does everybody hear me well? I think yes, right?
Very well.
Okay, so I'm gonna open the presentation and I will share it right now. Just a sec. Okay. Okay, do you see it? Can you see the presentation? Or no? No?
Sorry, I was on mute. We did see it a minute ago and now it's gone. Have you stopped sharing your screen? Here we go. I can see it again now.
You can see it?
Yep.
And if I... Okay, so the problem is that the effects won't work, but I think that's no problem at all.
Okay, I think you can present it as a normal presentation if you click the button at the bottom. Yeah, that's fine.
You see it right? Okay.
Yep.
So, hello everybody. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the attendants for being here, and especially Rachel for taking care of us during this project that unfortunately is slowly coming to an end. But thank you very much. The goal of my presentation is to show you the Quality of Life Index as a resource to monitor inclusive education for students with intellectual disabilities regarding the article number 24 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. However, prior to presenting this resource that will be publicly available as one of the deliverables of the project, I will present to the audience a couple of critical questions. These questions are: why to monitor inclusive education? And most important, how to monitor inclusive education? This critical question is the most important one. The answer may seem simple: to know the extent to which we are making progress in the path towards inclusion of our students. We will address this last question briefly presenting the Index for Inclusion. We have decided so because the Index for Inclusion is perhaps the world's best known resource to monitor the extent to which a school is advancing towards the inclusion of diverse learning. And presenting the Index for Inclusion as an example of tool to monitor inclusive education will help us to reach two goals of the presentation. First, to provide the audience with the rationale on why it is necessary to adopt a quality of life framework for monitoring purposes. And second, to help the audience understand how to use the Quality of Life Index as a tool, because it is based in how the Index for Inclusion usually works to guide the reflection process. We will finally present the Quality of Life Index for Inclusive Education, the tool that we've been developing through this project. And finally, we will talk about how is the state of art in Spain, how we are validating the Quality of Life Index for Inclusion Education as a standardized instrument to support the inclusion process of students with intellectual disability. Why to monitor inclusive education is one of the questions that I would like to address prior to presenting the Quality of Life Index. Well, talking about inclusive education means to talk about a right recognized in the article number 24 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. And according to that article, inclusive education must put the focus not only in the academic achievement, And beyond access, participation, and learning, inclusive education must ensure the development of students with intellectual disability to their fullest potential. Okay, this is clear, and we all share this value. But the logical question that now rises is, how do we know if we are advancing or not in the path towards inclusive education? In which elements do we have to put the focus to assess if we are advancing to inclusion? Let's gonna see this statement. What is not defined cannot be measured. What is not measured cannot be changed. This statement can help to understand the need to assess and monitor inclusive education. The question is that inclusive education is not only a right, it also implies adopting a commitment to action within the general education process. Inclusive education brings into action a set of values that are reflected in the way that each school conceives their students with ID and offers them opportunities to enhance their access, participation, learning, and development. Therefore, given that inclusive education is an ongoing process aimed at specific goals, it is necessary to gather evidences continuously about the extent to which the actions implemented in a given school are producing advances in the inclusion of their students. In addition, monitoring inclusive education is also important due to two fundamental reasons. First, motivation. Monitoring highlights the responsibilities of the different stakeholders in education, and that motivates them to action. And second, and most important, effective feedback. Monitoring allows early identification of problems and barriers in the implementation of inclusive education. And this is essential to adopt measures that transform these barriers into drivers of change. Before moving on to understand how to monitor inclusive education and present the example of the Index for Inclusion, it is necessary to clarify what we mean when we say that inclusive education must be monitored. The assessment of inclusive education does not have to be understood in terms of success or failure. Inclusive education is a process and therefore has no end. For this reason, there will never be a school that can claim itself fully inclusive because the reality changes, and what we are doing to include a student in a given moment, perhaps it's not going to be useful in another moment, even if we are talking about the same student. That's why inclusion and monitoring require us to work continuously. For this reason, inclusive education monitoring must follow a formative or functional assessment. The formative or functional assessment is that in which the evidence gathered is used to learn from what we are doing right or wrong, to act accordingly to improve our actions. The formative assessment is necessary to learn from ourselves, to advance in the inclusion of the students with ID, and to take the proper measures. This picture depicts a formative assessment approach. First, it is necessary to adopt a framework of assessment that will be addressed in the next slide. And second, we have to put ourselves in front of that framework to see what we are doing. Then, once we have the relevant information on our actions, it is necessary to establish priorities and address goals. And finally, it is necessary to keep going and maintain the changes done. And of course, update the goals and keep transforming our reality. How to monitor inclusive education? Answer to this question requires us to focus in two critical aspects: the variables to monitor and how to monitor them and what to do with the information that we are collecting. Monitoring must respond to a plan strategy to be as efficient as possible. The starting point must be to define the variables that will be monitored in the change process. Focusing the assessment of inclusive education on a whole education system would not be very operational in terms of change. This is so because each school and its educational community are unique. Therefore, trying to monitor inclusive education regarding a whole education system would not be sensitive to each reality. To make things happen, we need to focus at school level. According to Booth and Ainscough, the essential elements that help us understand the extent to which a school works towards inclusive education are its educational cultures, policies, and practices. The ongoing reflection and evidence gathering on these three elements is what will put each school in front of the mirror of inclusive education, allowing schools to organize the changes they need to meet the task of including diverse learners. Before offering the Index for Inclusion as a resource, an example for the audience to better understand what will be presented when addressing the Quality of Life Index for Inclusive Education, it is necessary to define each one of the three variables. By school cultures in plural, we refer to the values, beliefs, and principles shared in a school by its educational community. We talk about cultures and not about culture in singular, because in each school, several cultures can coexist, and they can be consistent or contradictory. Cultures are often reflected in institutional projects and also are reflected in the vision, mission, and values of the school. School policies refer to the explicit and articulated planning of its norms, procedures of actions. Examples would be the student admission policies of a given school. Policies have their foundation in school cultures, and they may or may not be consistent with such cultures. For example, it is not uncommon to find schools that are explicitly defined as inclusive and democratic, but they follow authoritarian decision-making processes and don't allow parents to participate, for example, when assessing the support needs of students with intellectual disability. Last, practices refer to the actions that are carried out on a daily basis by teachers and other professionals, both in the classroom and in other spaces or in complementary or extracurricular activities. Practices need policies that support them, and at the same time, practices are the way to embody the values and principles of school cultures. This diagram that you see represents the relationship commented between these three relevant variables to monitor inclusive education. From the perspective of Booth and Ensco, developing the index for inclusion, developing learning and participation in school, for a school successfully to move towards inclusion, it must align inclusive culture, policies, and practices. The point is how to move towards inclusive culture, policies, and practices. To answer this question, we must split it into two specific questions: how to monitor these three elements and what to do with the evidence obtained to inform process of change. In this sense, the Index for Inclusion offers a set of resources and guidelines for action for those schools that are interested in advancing the inclusion of all students. Once we have defined the culture, policies, and practices, now it is time to address the process of the school improvement proposed by the Index for Inclusion, which is the basis for the use of the Quality of Life Index for inclusive education. Okay. The improvement plan that incorporates the Index for Inclusion begins at the moment when each school considers that they need to improve as a school to respond to diversity. This improvement plan is based on a formative self-assessment of each school to advance in the path to inclusion. This figure shows the improvement process described subsequently that the Index for Inclusion facilitates. Okay, let's gonna start with what they call phase number 1. In this phase, the members of the educational community, not necessarily teachers, propose the need to improve the level of inclusion of their school. In this phase, it is necessary to create a planning team that represents the main stakeholders of the educational community. In addition, it is necessary to call what it is usually known as a critical friend. This person is usually someone from outside the school who has experience using the Index for Inclusion. The critical friend can facilitate access to the materials, help to understand the essential concepts of the tool, support the planning team for a better understanding of the evidences they are gathering through their reflections, and help things change. Although phase 1 represents the beginning of the implementation of the Index for Inclusion, it's in this phase when we should start to gather evidence about the processes carried out by our school in terms of culture, policies, and practices to include students with ID. To this end, the Index for Inclusion collects a set of indicators and questions to monitor and gather evidence on the three elements that I've aforementioned that we as a school are currently implementing to detect barriers to learning and participation for including diverse students. For each variable, culture, policies, and practices, the Index for Inclusion establishes two essential domains, which are specified through indicators that are developing operational questions that guide the shared reflection of the planning team on their own school. It is, since the indicators and questions are very exhaustive, it is essential that the planning team starts with a first contact to understand the indicators and question. This is necessary first to gain an understanding of the materials and to avoid falling in discouragement. Not all indicators must be used, and each planning team can decide where to start. As soon as the planning team becomes familiar with the basic concepts and materials, it is necessary to begin the reflection process, to begin the monitoring, to explore the school's priorities to improve the inclusion of students with ID. The following tables show you examples of the three variables. As you can see, culture domains, policies, and practices. For each one of the variables, you have two domains. For example, for the cultures, you have the building community domain and establishing inclusive value domains. In the second column, you have the indicators. For example, building community has a total of 11 indicators from A11, everyone is welcome, until A111, staff link what happens in school to children lives at home. As you can see in the right column, you have exemplary questions to guide the specific reflection. Okay, at the end, the change team has to make the reflection on the extent to which their school cultures are providing the opportunities that are described in the questions. The number in brackets represents the total number of operative questions to guide the reflections, and this is for everyone and all the different variables that are defined. The use of the indicators and questions is essential to build and fit the improvement plan. They allow to know the real needs of the school regarding each variable, from which it will be necessary to start working for including students with ID. In the specification of the improvement plan, it is essential to investigate the feeling of all the planning team members, as well as to make explicit their beliefs and views so that everyone gets involved with the improvement plan. This is a process of discovering together. Now we are in phase number 2, in which it is important to check everybody's understanding about the materials, the indicators, and the improvement plan to be developed. Once the plan is explicitly elaborated through phase 3, specifying priorities in short, medium, and long-term goals is essential to translate the plan into action. Phase number 4, and to facilitate the maintenance of the agreed actions. As a continuing process, it is essential to review the progress being made in the goals, phase 5, ongoing feedback, reinforcing the progress of the school, reflecting the processes taken, and readjusting the priorities by defining new goals. It will be necessary to move the focus from one indicator to another. In short, the indicators are useful to monitor and guide the reflections of the planning team and help in the task of defining operative goals to enhance the inclusion opportunities for all students, but always bearing in mind the school's culture, policies, and practices. And now you will ask, why to adopt a quality of life framework if we have a resource like the Index for Inclusion? I attended to a conference about a quality of life index for inclusion, and you are talking about the Index for Inclusion that we all know. But why to adopt a quality of life framework? Look, perspectives such as those included in the Index for Inclusion put the emphasis on monitoring current processes, the culture, policies, and practices, to learn from what we are doing as a school now in this moment to support the students' access, participation, and learning. This perspective, although widely known and used in the international sphere, lacks two relevant aspects. First, it focuses mainly in processes, the current actions that we are implementing in our school, but it does not put the focus to monitor the extent to which we are providing relevant outcomes in our students with intellectual disability through the processes that we are monitoring. And second, the monitoring is used to support access, participation, and learning, while it does not focus clearly on the goal of the development of students with intellectual disability to their fullest potential. To include these two elements in monitoring, one perspective that is gaining weight is the quality of life model developed by Shalok and Verdugo in 2002. This model defines quality of life as a state of personal well-being that is multidimensional and considers 8 domains in the student's life: emotional, physical, material well-being, personal development, self-determination, social inclusion, interpersonal relations, and rights, has universal and cultural properties, and we will go through this at a later moment, is influenced by personal environmental factors and by the interaction between those factors, and incorporates objective and subjective elements. Talking about quality of life in education means to put the focus on the student and the global domains that compose his or her life, and thus going beyond academic achievement, from which to understand the students' aspirations and needs to define programs and planning supports aimed at improving the students' personal outcomes in each one of the aforementioned 8 domains. In a nutshell, talking about quality in education means to shift the focus towards a whole child approach and to generate personal desired outcomes in all the areas composing the students' lives. What does this model bring for monitoring purposes? The model offers a monitoring and measurement framework validated by research. Reached this point, it is necessary to understand what we mean when we talk about the universal and cultural properties. The domains, the ones that you have in that table, are universal. That is, the areas that constitute a life of quality are the same for all people. For example, for a person with a physical disability living in Africa, the domains that constitute his or her quality of life are the same than for a person without a disability living in Europe. However, domains are not observable nor measurable. Thus, it is necessary to put them into action to find what is indicative of each domain. In this sense, each domain is developed through observable and measurable indicators that constitute behaviors, perceptions, and conditions of each domain. While the domains are universal, the indicators are not. The indicators are linked to culture and to the characteristics of individuals living in such cultures. For example, retaking the previous example about people living in Africa and Europe, what is indicative of emotional well-being for a person living in Africa with a physical disability, probably it will be different from what constitutes the emotional well-being for a person without a disability living in Europe, although for both of them, emotional well-being is important in terms of quality of life. In this sense, to monitor inclusive education through the quality of life model, it is necessary to work with the indicators. We need to develop a set of indicators relevant for the target population, in our case, for the group of students with intellectual disability. Working with the core indicators of the quality of life domains is critical, since the research has shown that the indicators of the domains are sensitive to the goals of the United Nations articles. Regarding article number 24, different authors suggest relationships between its goals and quality of life domains. For example, the right to access, okay, within the inclusive education right, the goal of access is linked to the rights domain of the quality of life model. Participation is linked to social inclusion and interpersonal relationships. Learning to self-determination and personal development, and development of students to their fullest potential with emotional, material, and physical well-being, personal development, and self-determination. As you can see, there are different domains that contribute to different goals of inclusive education. According to Morningstar and her colleagues, emotional, physical, material well-being, and personal development are transversal domains of quality of life that contribute to all the four goals of inclusive education and that are critical to provide students with post-school transition outcomes to enhance their chances of social inclusion in the society. How to use quality of life framework to monitor inclusive education, which is the proposal that we've developed in this project. The QUAL model offers a framework to gather evidence and or encourage reflection on students' personal outcomes in the 8 quality of life domains, which, as explained, through their indicators are sensitive to the goals of Article 24. This framework allows enriching the reflection-based monitoring of inclusive education, complementing and completing the one presented regarding the index for inclusion. That's why we decided to present the index first. The quality of life model, instead of putting the focus on the reflection on the current processes mobilized by the school through its culture, policies, and practices, focuses on the personal outcome that these processes are achieving, or that at least should be considering in students with intellectual disability. Following a formative assessment, the evidence gathered through this reflection should be used to support decision-making for an ongoing improvement on their own school's culture, policies, and practices, as the Index for Inclusion establishes, but always bearing in mind the aspiration, needs, and experiences of students with intellectual disabilities in the 8 domains related to the goals of access, participation, learning, and development of students to their fullest potential. As you can see, this reflection process goes a step beyond the Index for Inclusion. Monitoring inclusive education through the quality of life model, through the indicators, can follow a quantitative or a qualitative approach. Both approaches serve the purposes outlined above to guide the reflection, although it is necessary to know what they imply in order to know which one to use. The most desirable would be to follow a quantitative approach. The quantitative approach requires designing, developing, and validating specific instruments aimed at the measurement of personal outcomes in students with intellectual disabilities on each one of the different domains composing the student's quality of life. Through this approach, it is possible not only to guide reflections, as we have explained, but also to measure personal outcomes and to use the evidence gathered through the measurement of the personal outcomes to inform the changes in the policies. However, in the policies, culture, and practices. However, to use this approach, it is necessary to comply with a series of requisites. The most important is that the validation of the indicators to measure personal outcomes only has sense for a given target population of a certain context. In other words, to work with this approach in this project, it would have been necessary that each partner had defined and validated their own indicators, since items that reflect personal outcomes for students with ID in Spain may be different from those living in Belgium, Bulgaria, Greece, or Portugal, the countries that represent the different consortium. The consortium. Then it would have been necessary to make a pilot study to further validate the instrument. As for a qualitative approach, we use this as the index for inclusion to guide reflection, as I've already explained. To use the evidence gathered through the reflection process, focus always in the 8 quality of life domains to update our own culture, policies, and practices in terms of the outcomes that we are producing or not in our student. Although it cannot gather evidences to be sure about the extent to which the actions that we are implementing are producing changes in the life of the student, this approach is easier to achieve. Okay. Given this, in this project, we have developed 3 indexes with specific items as a way to define needs, aspirations, and goals for students attending to elementary education, primary education, and secondary education. Please note that the rationale for this is that the context of each educational stage is different, so the indicators change. Now we'll present as an example the quality of life index for primary education. I've chosen this version, the version of primary education, because it's the one that we are validating in Spain, and I will talk later about the process that we have followed. The goal of the Quality of Life Index for Inclusive Education, Primary Education version, is to provide schools with a set of items to guide their reflections on the extent to which their culture, practices, and policies are focused on the whole development of their students with ID, something consistent with the Article 24 of the United Nations Conventions. Hence, this tool is intended to help schools in monitoring their current culture, policies, and practices towards the identification of barriers that can hinder the development of their students to their fullest potential. Through the reflection processes based on the items provided, schools can monitor and gather evidence on the barriers they have to build and develop improvement plans and strategies to update their practices, culture, and policies, bearing in mind key areas to enhance the development of their students with intellectual disability. The information gathered on the barriers and the strengths can be prioritized for each quality of life domain, and then specific change plans can be collegiately created to take an action and make things happen. By enhancing students' outcomes in the quality of life domains, schools are contributing not only to the development of their students with ID to their full potential, but also to other areas relevant for their inclusion, access, participation, and learning. Then, of course, it is necessary to maintain an ongoing feedback to keep the changes adopted and to detect new barriers and keep adapting to the reality. Normally, when we use this tool, we focus on a specific quality of life domain, the one which is most threatened in a given school. As you can see, the Quality of Life Index for Inclusive Education starts with a justification on why to use a quality of life approach that can bring for monitoring inclusive education. And then the steps that the schools can follow are to adopt this tool are presented. As this table shows, the process followed is the same than for the index for inclusion. We even propose to use the quality of life index along with the index for inclusion to strengthen the reflection guided by the index by focusing on outcomes and in all the inclusive education goals. Each stage has a series of tips and specific annexes with example of tasks to do at each stage to make the change happen. In a first moment, this is a global or a group task, it is necessary to define a change group composed by relevant stakeholder. This is a change or planning team as the one that we defined when we were talking about the index for inclusion. We always, in the tool that we have developed, we provide an Annex 1 already filled with explanation on how to accomplish each task, and then we provide a template for the schools to create their own groups. In a second moment, as a group, it is necessary to discuss and make explicit the own school's culture, policies, and practices, as well as the school's mission, vision, and values, to have explicit the identity that the school has. Now, we have a couple of tasks which are the individual reflection, which is critical to create lately the change plan. Annex number 3 provides a total of 80 quality of life items that define needs, experiences, and aspirations of students with intellectual disabilities attending to primary education according to the 8 quality of life domains. These are examples of items for the interpersonal relations domains. Bearing in mind the mission, vision, and values that the school as a group have made explicit, and thinking in terms of the school's culture, policies, and practices, it is necessary that each member of the change team makes an individual reflection on the extent to which the school culture, policies, and practices are focused to achieve the personal outcomes that are defined in the items. The items are the glasses that each participant will wear during the reflection process. However, although each member of the group, of the change group, is going to use the items to guide the reflection must be placed on how the school's cultures, policies, and practices contribute to the achievement of the personal outcome described in the items. The information that each person gathers through this monitoring exercise will allow to identify the school's barrier for improvement purposes. What are the barriers that my school's cultures have to generate positive interpersonal relations in students with intellectual disability, for example? Annex number 4 is another individual task. In this case, it consists in identifying, based on the previous reflection, the barriers, difficulties, and the opportunities or resources that each one finds regarding the school's culture, policies, and practices to enhance personal outcomes. We have made a brief space to identify a couple or 3 of different difficulties and strengths per each quality of life domain. In Annex number 5, now we start again group tasks. In this case, once the individual's assessment have been completed, it is time for the team to sit and talk to put together the individual reflections. Now it is time to prioritize those barriers for the domain, in singular, the domain, the quality of the domain, that the group feel that is threatened the most, according to the assessment of the school's culture, policies, and practices. A good way to make this prioritization would be to reach an agreement based on the same or similar barriers detected consistently by the team members in the individual assessment. Reached this point, it is necessary to start thinking about a specific plan to address the most pressing barrier and transform it into a facilitator for students' development regarding the quality of life domain selected. In this sense, the prioritization should address specific goals to increase the chances of success. Bearing this in mind, it is necessary to identify around 3 priorities to start working, one for the cultures, one for the policies, and one for the practices. It is important to accept that there will be probably more than one priority, but the team needs to be patient and saves its energies, as inclusive education is an ongoing process and the other barriers can be addressed at a different moment. We are trying here to identify the most pressing need of change based on the personal outcomes and reflection on the extent to which the school is providing opportunities for the student to achieve the outcomes relevant for that domain. Annex number 5 provides the change team with tables where the team can both identify the most pressing need to address and the specific improvement plan, use of resources, use of strategies, temporalization, etc. Focused always in improving the quality of life of students. The annex provides 3 planning sheets, one for each variable: culture, policies, and practice. The main limitation of a quality of life index for inclusive education under a qualitative approach is that it is not possible to know if the changes accomplished by the school really produce a change in a student's outcome or not. But as I said, it was not possible for us to accomplish this task given the nature of the project. Now, I'm going to explain the current situation in Spain. As I explained, there was another alternative to monitor inclusive education based in a quantitative approach. And I will present now what we have done in Spain towards adopting such approach. We have started to develop the Quality of Life Index for inclusive education, primary education version. This work will take about 3 years, okay? Year 2020 has been the first year of our work, so it will finish in 2022, we assume, okay? In this year, we have identified the core and relevant indicators of each quality of life domain for students with intellectual disabilities attending to general education classrooms in primary education in Spain, and we have assured their content validity. With this, we have identified a set of 96 valid items that will constitute the starting point to validate a standardized instrument that can serve us and schools to evaluate personal outcomes in students with intellectual disabilities to support the reflection with evidence in the main quality of life domains. The process followed to identify the indicators and provide them with content validity has been the following. In a first moment, we have identified relevant quality of life indicators for Spaniards with ID aged from 6 to 12 years old attending to general education classrooms in the stage of primary education. For this, we have followed two steps process. First, two parallel reviews. A systematic literature review to identify core indicators for each quality of life domain in the target population. After identifying literature, we have selected those relevant indicators related to personal characteristics, indicators relevant for a person with intellectual disability, and also attending to environmental factors. We have identified indicators relevant to a general education context and the stage of primary education. Once these indicators were identified, we designed a set of items that collected personal needs, experiences, and aspirations with which to assess personal outcomes based on the indicators that operationalize the quality of life domains for the target population. Some of the items emerged from the literature review, but also from the study of already existing quality of life standardized instruments. As a result of this stage, we developed 240 items, 30 per quality of life domains, around the relevant indicators identified. In a second moment, we maintain a series of discussions with direct practice professionals, mainly teachers and support staff working with children with intellectual disabilities, and also with researcher experts in quality of life and inclusive education. It was an iterative process in which we discussed the pertinence of the items that we had generated in the previous step regarding the goal of the future tool. Once the discussion finished, we made an initial reduction from 240 to 154 items. And then we proceeded to provide the items with content validity. To do this, we follow a Delphi study with a group of 14 professionals. The Delphi study involved 4 rounds, and on each round, professionals had to do different tasks. Round number 1, professionals receive an Excel page with the 154 items organized in the 8 quality of life domains. In the first task, they had to assess each one of the 154 items against 4 criteria. Suitability.
Sorry, Antonio, you just have 1 more minute left, and then we can have time for questions, if that's okay.
Yes.
Sorry to just, yeah.
So, but I didn't understand you. What did you say?
Just 1 or 2 minutes more, and then hopefully we can stop for some questions.
It's the last slide. This is the last slide.
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay. In the first task, they had to assess each item against 4 criteria, and we use quantitative statistics based on the mean and the standard deviation that the items obtain in the 4 criteria, and we retain 113 items. In the second task, professionals could create a maximum of 5 items per domain, and we, as a research team, assess the different proposals made by the professionals working in the Delphi. We assess the items against significance, sensitivity, and clarity. Of the 111 items generated by professionals, we retain 61. We consider that 61 were suitable for the purposes of the tool. In a second round, professionals had to decide if they would include the 61 items generated previously that were considered adequate by us, or not in the final instrument. To accomplish this task, we created an online survey with 61 questions, and each question represented one of the items. Professionals had to choose between 2 options. Yes, I would include the item, or not, I would not include it. For an item to be considered valid, it had to be the agreement of at least 12 professionals out of 14. This happened for 36 items. Round number 4, we created a forum and professionals discussed to retrieve previously eliminated items in the material and personal well-being domains that were the domains for which a higher number of items had been eliminated in the previous round. Professionals could also propose new items for these 2 domains, and they created a total of 24 new items. In the round 4, for the 60 items obtained through rounds 2 and 3, professionals had to evaluate them again, and we use the same criteria as for round number 1. At the very end, we had a total of 157 validated items, but this is not operative for developing a standardized instrument, so we made a final reduction of items, and we have a pilot version with 96 items that will be further validated to develop a quantitative assessment instrument. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry for the time. And muchas gracias, arigato, and everything, all the languages of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for a very good presentation. Does anybody have any questions? I think I can already see them, some in the chat. Just let me have a look.
Okay, I see now a question in the chat, relevant question about, I will start since the beginning, okay?
Yep, go for it.
Okay, it is not clear for me why the model should be limited to students with intellectual disabilities. In my opinion, this can be applied in a more broad way by Marlene Cleason. Okay, Marlene, good morning. I absolutely agree with you. We've been working with the quality of life model with adult and children population regarding both regarding different conditions, since elderly populations, population with acquired brain injury, with developmental disabilities, with intellectual disabilities, hearing impairment. But the point is that in this project, we have to focus only in students with intellectual disabilities. That's why we validated the indicators with the population. But we have already other projects, and we are working with other population of people with different kind of disabilities to identify the relevant domains in their lives and how to enhance their outcomes in those domains. So answering to your question, we use this model in a more broad way. Even people with HIV and who are abused from the consumption of substances. So thank you very much. Now in Belgium, in Ghent, there is a very active group by Jessica de Meyer and the Hogeschool Ghent, and they are working a lot with the quality of life model in the social services. So yes, I agree with that question. Of course, I don't know if I've answered it.
Yes, I just wanted to add that if you see how the index has evolved, I mean, the last version of the index also works on much broader, also diversity in a very, very general way. So I'm glad that you agree with my remark. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the appreciation. And Ali Dunhill, this is a really interesting concept. I'm interested in the individuals and organizations that participated in the development of the toolkit. Were any children and young people consulted, or did any participate in a pilot feedback activities? Well, this is a very interesting question. We normally accomplish the validation of the items following a Delphi study and also focus and discussion groups to involve all the stakeholders. In this case, unfortunately, the focus group, we have not done it yet because of the COVID-19 situation in Spain. Okay, we could not gather to make a meeting with family members, relatives, and of course, students with intellectual disabilities, but we have planned this at a later stage to make their reflections. Also, quality of life is always based, as I said in one of the slides, it has objective and subjective properties. The best approach to assess quality of life is based in a third-party assessment, report of others, but also a self-assessment. And for this case, we always develop the indicators on the own point of view of the person with intellectual disabilities. That's why we always try to involve families, individuals with disabilities of any kind, depending on the population we are working with, and of course, professionals who are actively engaged in the supports provisions and supports planning with these populations. So asking to your questions, we are going to have focus groups to complement the findings of the Delphi study with professionals.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Okay. I think that's a good place to stop, as we're due to stop at 12. Thank you very
Sorry,
much. Sorry,
Rachel, one last thing. I'm going to
Yeah.
copy here my email just in case
Perfect.
that someone is interested in knowing more about the tool or something like that.
I'd also ask, would it be possible to have your presentation so that we can send to
For
the
sure.
participants?
Yes, I
Okay,
will send
thank
it
you
you
very much.
later at the email, okay?
Yeah, thank you very much. As it's yeah, it's been a very interesting experience to learn more about this as a project partner and the work that you're doing. And I think it will be going forward a very useful tool. And I'm excited to see its validation in Spain and hopefully elsewhere as well across Europe. So thank you again. And we'll now go back to our final session. We've got a panel session on the European education area and how it can support inclusive education. We'll have a representative of the European Commission, an MEP, and also some of our partners in the project on that panel. So I asked if you rejoin the final session via the link that you were sent in your registration mail. So you can also find that link in the chat box. So now we'll move back to the final panel that will start in 5 minutes. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Antonio for speaking, our captioner, Lee, for your lightning fast captioning during that presentation.
I'm sorry for my terrible accent. You know, I'm Spanish.
No,
I try my best.
you have a very good accent. Do not worry. Yeah, thank you very much. And Marina for being our host. So thank you, everybody, and see you in a few minutes. Bye.
See you. Goodbye.